Hello, my dear friend. Look, I'm going to be brutally honest with you. Everything you've been told about intelligence, it's probably wrong. I spent years thinking I wasn't smart enough, that some people were just born brilliant while the rest of us were destined to struggle. I watched colleagues climb corporate ladders while I felt stuck. I saw friends master new skills effortlessly while I fumbled. And you know what the worst part was? I believed it was all about natural talent. That intelligence was this fixed thing you either had or didn't. But here's what nobody tells you, and trust me, this changes everything. The smartest people you know aren't actually smarter than you. They've just cracked a code that most people never discover. And in the next few minutes, I'm going to share that exact code with you. Because once you understand this, once you truly internalize what I'm about to reveal, your entire trajectory changes. We're not talking about small improvements here. We're talking about a complete transformation in how you think, learn, and grow. So let me ask you something. When was the last time you learned something that genuinely excited you? Not because you had to, but because you wanted to. When was the last time you felt your brain expanding, making connections you'd never seen before? If you're struggling to answer that question, you're not alone. And more importantly, you're exactly where I was 3 years ago. Rehook, the turning point. 3 years ago, I was sitting in my apartment at 2 a.m., scrolling through social media, watching people half my age achieve things I'd only dreamed about. And I remember thinking, what's wrong with me? Why can't I figure this out? But that night, something clicked. I stumbled across a research paper that completely shattered everything I believed about intelligence. And what I discovered didn't just change my career, it changed my entire life. Chapter 1. The Mindset Breakthrough. Here's the thing about intelligence that schools never teach you. Your brain is not a fixed computer with limited storage. It's more like a garden. And just like a garden, it grows based on what you plant, how you nurture it, and the environment you create. I know that sounds like some motivational poster nonsense, but stay with me, because the science behind this is absolutely mind-blowing. Remember when you learned to ride a bike? At first, it felt impossible. Your body didn't know what to do. You fell. You scraped your knees. But then, slowly, something magical happened. Your brain started forming new pathways. Neurons connected in ways they never had before, and suddenly, riding a bike became second nature. That same process, it never stops, ever. Your brain has this incredible ability called neuroplasticity. Fancy word, I know. But here's what it actually means. Every single time you learn something new, your brain physically rewires itself. New connections form. Old pathways strengthen. You're literally building new mental architecture with every experience. And this is where most people get it wrong. They think learning is about memorizing facts or passing tests. But real learning, real intelligence, it's about building these neural networks that help you think differently, solve problems creatively, and adapt to whatever life throws at you. Let me tell you about my friend Marcus. Marcus struggled through school. He barely graduated high school, and college was never even on his radar. Everyone wrote him off as not book smart. But Marcus had this obsession with understanding how things worked. He'd take apart engines, study electrical systems, teach himself programming languages just for fun. Today, Marcus runs a tech company worth millions, not because he suddenly became smarter, but because he understood something crucial. Intelligence isn't about what you know right now. It's about your willingness to keep learning, to stay curious, to embrace the discomfort of not knowing. And that's the first key. That's the foundation everything else builds on. The fixed mindset trap. I used to have what psychologists call a fixed mindset. Whenever I failed at something, I'd tell myself, see, I'm just not good at this. Math was hard. I'm not a math person. Public speaking terrified me. I'm just naturally introverted. These stories we tell ourselves, they're prison cells we build in our own minds. Because here's what I've learned. When you believe your abilities are fixed, you unconsciously avoid challenges. Why? Because challenges threaten your identity. If you fail, it proves you're not smart enough, talented enough, good enough. But people with what's called a growth mindset, they see challenges completely differently. They see them as opportunities, not in some cheesy, fake positive way, but genuinely, because they understand that struggle is the price of admission for growth. Think about it like this. When you go to the gym and lift weights, your muscles feel uncomfortable, right? That discomfort isn't a sign you're doing something wrong. It's literally the feeling of your muscles growing stronger. The same thing happens in your brain. That feeling when you're learning something difficult, that confusion, that frustration, that's not weakness. That's your brain forming new connections. That's intelligence being built in real time. I remember the first time I truly understood this. I was trying to learn Spanish for a business trip to Mexico, and I was terrible. Absolutely awful. I'd conjugate verbs wrong, mix up words, feel embarrassed every time I spoke. The old me would have quit, would have said, I'm just not good at languages. But instead, I reminded myself, I'm not good at Spanish yet. That one word, yet, it changes everything. Because yet acknowledges that abilities can be developed. It transforms failure from a permanent verdict into temporary feedback. It opens up possibilities instead of closing them down. And you know what happened? 6 months later, I was having actual conversations in Spanish. Not perfect conversations, but real ones. Because I stopped seeing mistakes as proof of inability and started seeing them as stepping stones toward competence, the science of growth. Now, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I've spent hundreds of hours reading research, talking to experts, and experimenting on myself. And what I've learned is absolutely fascinating. Your brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons. Each neuron can form thousands of connections with other neurons. These connections, called synapses, are how information flows through your brain. Every time you learn something new, your brain forms new synaptic connections. Every time you practice a skill, those connections get stronger and faster. It's like building highways in your mind. The more you use a particular route, the wider and smoother that highway becomes. And here's the part that blew my mind. This process continues throughout your entire life. You don't have to be a kid to learn new things. You don't have to be in school to expand your intelligence. Your brain remains plastic, adaptable, and capable of growth until the day you die. I've seen this firsthand. My mother learned to use a computer at 65. Not just email, but graphic design software, video editing, social media marketing. People told her she was too old, that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. But those people didn't understand neuroplasticity. They didn't understand that age isn't the barrier. Belief is the barrier. Reframing challenges. So how do you actually shift from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset? How do you start seeing challenges as opportunities instead of threats? First, you need to catch yourself when fixed mindset thinking creeps in. And trust me, it will creep in. It happens to me all the time. I'll be working on something difficult, and I'll hear that voice in my head saying, "You're not smart enough for this." And instead of believing that voice, I've learned to recognize it as just old programming trying to protect me from discomfort. Then I reframe it. I literally talk to myself differently. Instead of, "I can't do this," I say, "I can't do this yet, but I can learn." Instead of, "This is too hard," I say, "This is challenging," which means I'm growing. It sounds simple, maybe even silly, but the language you use with yourself matters more than you might think, because your brain listens to what you tell it. Second, I started celebrating struggle instead of avoiding it. Whenever I encounter something that frustrates me, I try to remind myself, this discomfort means I'm at the edge of my current abilities. This is where growth happens. Think about video games for a second. The best games have this perfect balance of challenge and skill. If a game is too easy, it's boring. If it's too hard, it's frustrating. But when it's right at that edge where you're constantly stretched but still progressing, that's when it becomes addictive. That's exactly how learning should feel. You want to be operating at the edge of your abilities, where things are challenging but not overwhelming. That's the growth zone. And third, I changed how I view failure. Failure isn't the opposite of success. It's part of the path to success. Every successful person you admire has failed more times than most people have even tried. The difference is they didn't let failure define them. They extracted the lessons, adjusted their approach, and kept moving forward. I used to be terrified of looking stupid. I'd avoid asking questions in meetings because I didn't want people to think I didn't understand. I'd pretend to know things I didn't because admitting ignorance felt like admitting weakness. But you know what I've realized? The smartest people in any room are usually the ones asking the most questions because they're not trying to protect their ego. They're trying to learn. Practical application. All right, let's make this practical. Because understanding mindset is one thing. Actually shifting your mindset is another. Here's what I want you to do. Think about one area of your life where you've been telling yourself a fixed mindset story. Maybe it's, "I'm not creative," or "I'm bad with money," or "I can't lead people." Now, I want you to add "yet" to the end of that statement. I'm not creative yet. I'm bad with money yet. I can't lead people yet. Feel the difference? That single word opens up possibility. It transforms a permanent limitation into a temporary challenge. Next, identify one small action you could take to start developing that ability. Not something massive, something small and manageable. If you think you're not creative, maybe you spend 10 minutes a day sketching or writing or trying to solve problems in unconventional ways. If you're bad with money, maybe you read one article about personal finance each week. If you can't lead people, maybe you volunteer to facilitate one meeting or mentor one junior colleague. The specific action doesn't matter nearly as much as the consistency, because what you're really doing is rewiring your brain. You're proving to yourself that change is possible. You're building new neural pathways that support your growth. And every time you do this, every time you choose growth over comfort, you're voting for the person you want to become. Chapter 2. The Compound Effect of Microlearning. Now, here's where things get really interesting, because once you understand that intelligence can be grown, the next question becomes, how do you actually grow it consistently without burning out? Most people think learning requires huge blocks of time. They imagine going back to school, taking intensive courses, spending hours each day studying. And because that feels overwhelming and impractical, they don't do anything. But I discovered something that completely changed my approach to learning. And it's based on a principle that applies to almost everything in life. Small, consistent actions compound over time. Let me give you an example from my own life. About 2 years ago, I realized I knew almost nothing about history, and I felt embarrassed about it. But the thought of reading massive history textbooks felt daunting. So I made a deal with myself. Just 15 minutes a day. That's it. I'd listen to a history podcast during my commute or read a chapter from a popular history book before bed. 15 minutes doesn't sound like much, right? It barely feels like you're doing anything. But here's what happened. Over a year, those 15-minute sessions added up to over 90 hours of learning. 90 hours. That's like taking a college course. But it never felt overwhelming because I was only committing to 15 minutes at a time. This is the power of what I call microlearning. And it's one of the most underrated strategies for continuous growth. The science of spacing. There's actual science behind why this works so well. Researchers call it the spacing effect. Your brain doesn't process information like a hard drive, storing everything perfectly in one go. Instead, it needs time to consolidate new information, to integrate it with existing knowledge, to move it from short-term to long-term memory. When you try to cram a ton of information all at once, most of it disappears within days. You might remember it long enough for a test, but it doesn't stick. But when you space out your learning, when you return to information multiple times over days and weeks, your brain has multiple opportunities to strengthen those neural connections. The information becomes part of your permanent knowledge base. Think about it like watering a plant. If you dump a gallon of water on a plant once a month, most of that water just runs off. The plant can't absorb it all at once. But if you give it a little water every few days, the plant thrives. Your brain works the same way. Little bits of consistent learning are far more effective than occasional intensive study sessions. My micro-learning system. So, how do you actually implement micro-learning in your life? Let me share the exact system I use. First, I identified pockets of time that were previously wasted. My commute, waiting in line, the 20 minutes before I fall asleep. Those random moments throughout the day when I'd mindlessly scroll through social media. Then I filled those pockets with high-quality learning content. I subscribed to educational podcasts that I genuinely enjoyed. I downloaded articles about topics I was curious about. I found YouTube channels that made complex subjects accessible and engaging. The key word there is enjoyed. I didn't force myself to consume content I found boring just because it was educational. Because the moment learning becomes a chore, you stop doing it. Instead, I looked for content that sparked genuine curiosity. That made me think, wow, that's fascinating. I want to know more. For me, that included podcasts about psychology, business strategy, and human behavior. YouTube videos about physics, astronomy, and technology. Articles about productivity, creativity, and decision-making. Your interests might be completely different, and that's perfect. The goal isn't to learn specific things. It's to develop the habit of continuous learning about things that matter to you. Second, I practiced active engagement instead of passive consumption. This is crucial. Most people consume information passively. They listen to podcasts or read articles, and then nothing. The information goes in one ear and out the other. But I started doing something different. After consuming any piece of content, I'd take just 2 to 3 minutes to actively process it. Sometimes, I'd jot down the 3 most interesting ideas in my phone. Sometimes, I'd explain the main concepts to my partner over dinner. Sometimes, I'd just sit quietly and think about how the information connected to things I already knew. This active engagement makes all the difference because it forces your brain to actually process the information instead of just letting it wash over you. Third, I focused my learning around specific goals or interests. Instead of randomly consuming information about everything, I identified a few areas I wanted to develop and concentrated my microlearning there. For example, when I was working on improving my leadership skills, I specifically sought out content about management, communication, and team dynamics. When I wanted to understand investing better, I focused on finance and economics content. This focused approach creates something researchers call elaborative encoding. You're not just learning isolated facts. You're building interconnected webs of knowledge where new information connects to and reinforces existing knowledge. The compound effect in action. Let me tell you what happened after I'd been doing this for about 6 months. I started noticing I could hold more interesting conversations. When people brought up topics I knew nothing about 6 months earlier, I had context and insights to contribute. I started seeing patterns and connections between different fields that I'd never noticed before. An idea from psychology would help me understand a business challenge. A concept from physics would shed light on a relationship dynamic. My confidence grew, not in an arrogant way, but in a genuine way. I felt more capable, more prepared, more able to tackle challenges that came my way. And here's the beautiful part. It never felt like work. Because I was only investing small amounts of time, it felt effortless. But those small investments were compounding into significant growth. Think about compound interest in investing. If you invest just a small amount consistently over time, the growth becomes exponential. The same principle applies to learning. A person who reads for just 15 minutes a day will read about 15 to 20 books a year. That's 150 to 200 books over a decade. Can you imagine how much your worldview would expand after absorbing that much knowledge? A person who listens to educational podcasts during their 30-minute commute gets an hour of learning every single day. That's 365 hours per year. That's like taking 9 full college courses annually without ever setting foot in a classroom. These numbers might sound crazy, but they're real, and they're accessible to anyone willing to make small, consistent investments in their growth. Overcoming the biggest obstacle. Now, I know what you might be thinking. This sounds great in theory, but I'm already overwhelmed. I don't have time for one more thing. I get it. I really do. Because I've felt the same way. But here's what I realized. You're not adding time to your day. You're transforming time you're already spending. You're already commuting. You're already waiting in line. You're already scrolling through your phone before bed. You're not creating new time. You're just choosing to fill existing time differently. And honestly, once you start, you'll probably find that learning is more engaging than whatever you were doing before. Listening to a fascinating podcast is way more satisfying than mindlessly scrolling through social media. Reading an interesting article is more enjoyable than watching whatever random video the algorithm throws at you. The hardest part is just starting, creating that initial momentum. But once you build the habit, it becomes as natural as brushing your teeth. Start small, really small, maybe just 5 minutes a day. Choose one podcast episode for your commute. Read one article before bed. That's it. Don't worry about being perfect. Don't stress about optimizing everything immediately. Just start. Because here's the truth. The best time to start was years ago. The second best time is right now. And this is just the beginning. Because microlearning is just one piece of the puzzle. There are specific strategies for choosing what to learn, techniques for processing information more effectively, and systems for applying what you learn in ways that actually matter. But before we dive into those, you need to understand something fundamental about how you consume information in our modern world. Because most people are drowning in information while starving for wisdom. And there's a reason why. Chapter 3, The Information Diet. You know what's fascinating? We live in an age where you can access virtually unlimited information within seconds. The entire knowledge of human civilization is literally at your fingertips. And yet, most people aren't getting smarter. If anything, they're getting more confused, more overwhelmed, more paralyzed by information overload. I learned this lesson the hard way. A few years ago, I was consuming content like crazy. I'd wake up and immediately check news apps. I'd scroll through Twitter during breakfast, LinkedIn during lunch, YouTube before bed. I'd subscribe to dozens of newsletters, follow hundreds of accounts, download every recommended app. And I felt productive. I felt informed. I thought I was learning. But here's what was actually happening. I was drowning in a sea of noise while starving for signal. My brain was constantly switching between topics, never going deep enough to actually understand anything. I was consuming information, but I wasn't building knowledge, and I definitely wasn't developing wisdom. The turning point came during a conversation with my mentor, Sarah. She asked me a simple question. What's the most important thing you learned this week? I froze. Despite consuming probably 20 hours of content that week, I couldn't articulate a single meaningful insight. It had all just disappeared, washed away in the constant flood of new information. That's when I realized information consumption without strategy is just entertainment. and not even good entertainment. The curation principle. So I completely changed my approach. Instead of trying to consume everything, I became ruthlessly selective about what I let into my mind. Think about it like this. You're careful about what you eat, right? You understand that junk food might taste good in the moment, but it makes you feel terrible and damages your health over time. You know that a diet of high-quality, nutritious food is essential for physical well-being. Your information diet works exactly the same way. What you feed your mind directly affects your mental health, your decision-making ability, your worldview, your success. But most people treat their information consumption like an all-you-can-eat buffet at a sketchy restaurant. They consume whatever's put in front of them without questioning the quality or relevance. I started asking myself 3 questions before consuming any piece of content. First, will this information help me achieve my goals or solve real problems I'm facing? This immediately eliminated probably 70% of the content I was previously consuming. Celebrity gossip? Doesn't help my goals. Random viral videos? Not solving any of my problems. Political arguments from people I'll never meet? Complete waste of mental energy. Now, I'm not saying you can never consume entertainment, but you need to be honest about what it is. If you're watching a TV show to relax and decompress, great. But don't pretend you're staying informed when you're really just distracting yourself. Second, is this source credible and deeply knowledgeable about this topic? This was huge for me because I realized I was getting most of my information from people who weren't actually experts. Social media influencers talking about topics they barely understood. News articles written by journalists with no specialized knowledge. YouTube videos made by people who'd researched a topic for a few hours and were now presenting themselves as authorities. Instead, I started going directly to primary sources. If I wanted to learn about nutrition, I'd read research papers and books by actual nutritionists, not fitness influencers. If I wanted to understand economics, I'd study content from economists, not business podcasters. The quality difference was night and day. Suddenly, I was getting nuanced, evidence-based information instead of oversimplified hot takes designed to generate engagement. Third, am I consuming this actively or passively? This might be the most important question of all, because passive consumption is basically worthless. Let me explain what I mean. When you passively consume content, you're just letting it wash over you. You might feel like you're learning, but nothing's actually sticking. It's like standing in the rain and expecting to get hydrated. Active consumption is different. It means engaging with the material, asking questions, taking notes, connecting new information to existing knowledge, thinking about how you might apply what you're learning. I started treating every piece of content I consumed as a potential teacher. After listening to a podcast, I'd spend 5 minutes writing down the key insights and how I might use them. After reading an article, I'd discuss it with someone to solidify my understanding. This active engagement transformed consumption from entertainment into actual learning. The depth over breadth strategy. Here's another mistake I used to make, trying to learn a little bit about everything instead of developing deep expertise in a few key areas. I'd start learning about investing, then get distracted by content about psychology, then shift to productivity systems, then move on to health optimization. I was a mile wide and an inch deep in everything. But you know what I noticed about truly successful people? They have deep expertise in specific domains while maintaining a broad general knowledge base. They're T-shaped, deep in a few areas, broad in many. So I identified 3 core domains that were most relevant to my goals: leadership and communication, strategic thinking and decision-making, and personal effectiveness and growth. These were the areas that would have the biggest impact on my career and life. Then I committed to going deep in these areas. I didn't just skim surface-level content. I read foundational books. I studied case examples. I experimented with applying concepts. I sought out experts to learn from directly. And you know what happened? My competence in these areas grew exponentially. I could see patterns and connections that others missed. I could solve problems that seemed intractable to people with only surface-level knowledge. Meanwhile, I maintained lighter engagement with other interesting topics. I'd still read the occasional article about science or technology or culture, but I wasn't trying to become an expert in everything. I was just staying generally informed and curious. This focused approach is so much more effective than scattered learning. It's the difference between being pretty good at many things versus being excellent at a few important things. Information synthesis. But here's where it gets really powerful. Once you start building deep knowledge in multiple domains, you can start synthesizing insights across fields. This is where breakthrough thinking happens. The most innovative ideas usually come from combining concepts from different disciplines in novel ways. I remember reading about how Elon Musk approached problem solving. He'd study physics, engineering, economics, and psychology, then synthesize insights from all these fields to tackle challenges in entirely new ways. You can do the same thing on a smaller scale. Let me give you a personal example. I was struggling with team motivation at work. Traditional management approaches weren't working. Then I remembered something I'd learned from a psychology podcast about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. I combined that with insights from a book about game design and how games create engagement. And suddenly, I had a completely new framework for thinking about team motivation. That solution didn't come from just studying management. It came from connecting ideas from different domains. This is why your information diet matters so much. You're not just collecting facts. You're building a mental library of concepts, frameworks, and insights that you can recombine in creative ways. Chapter 4. Building Mental Flexibility. All right, let's talk about something that most people completely overlook, but is absolutely critical for real intelligence: cognitive flexibility. What do I mean by that? It's the ability to adapt your thinking based on context, to see problems from multiple angles, to switch between different mental frameworks depending on what the situation requires. Most people develop one way of thinking about the world and then apply that same approach to every situation. They're like someone who only knows how to use a hammer, so every problem looks like a nail. But the smartest people I know, they're like master chefs with a fully equipped kitchen. They've got multiple tools, multiple techniques, multiple recipes, and they know which one to use when. The perspective practice. I'll be honest with you. Developing cognitive flexibility was really uncomfortable for me at first because it required something I wasn't good at, being wrong. See, I used to get really attached to my opinions. Once I formed a belief about something, I'd defend it fiercely. Changing my mind felt like admitting defeat, like showing weakness. But then I realized something. The people I admired most, the ones who made the best decisions and had the most interesting insights, they changed their minds all the time. Not randomly, but when new evidence warranted it. They held their beliefs lightly, like hypotheses to be tested rather than identities to be defended. So I started practicing what I call perspective shifting. Whenever I had a strong opinion about something, I'd force myself to argue the opposite position, not just superficially, but genuinely trying to understand the strongest possible case for the other side. This was incredibly eye-opening because I'd discovered that most issues are way more nuanced than I initially thought, that people who disagreed with me often had legitimate reasons for their views, that my initial certainty was usually based on incomplete information. Let me give you a concrete example. I used to be really skeptical about meditation. I thought it was just New Age nonsense without any real benefit. That belief made me dismiss any information about meditation without actually examining it. But then I decided to practice perspective shifting. I asked myself, what if I'm wrong about this? What would the strongest case for meditation look like? So I actually researched it, not to confirm my skepticism, but to genuinely understand. And I discovered there's significant scientific evidence supporting meditation's benefits for focus, stress reduction, and emotional regulation. I tried it myself. And guess what? It actually helped. But I would have missed out on that benefit entirely if I'd stuck rigidly to my initial belief. This practice of actively seeking out opposing viewpoints has made me a much better thinker. I'm less prone to blind spots. I make better decisions because I consider more factors. I'm more persuasive because I understand objections and can address them. The Mental Model Toolkit. Another key aspect of cognitive flexibility is developing multiple mental models for understanding the world. A mental model is basically a framework or lens through which you interpret reality. It's how you make sense of complex situations and predict outcomes. Most people operate with just a few mental models, usually drawn from their primary field of work or study. An engineer might see everything through a systems lens. A salesperson might see everything through a persuasion lens. A financial analyst might see everything through a numbers lens. But limiting yourself to one or two mental models is like trying to navigate a complex city with an incomplete map. You might do okay in familiar areas, but you'll get lost in unfamiliar territory. So I started deliberately studying mental models from different disciplines. I learned about feedback loops from systems thinking. I learned about compound effects from finance. I learned about network effects from technology. I learned about cognitive biases from psychology. And then I practiced applying these different models to the same situation to see what insights emerged. For instance, let's say I'm trying to understand why my team isn't performing well. Through a systems thinking lens, I might look at feedback loops and bottlenecks in our processes. Through a psychology lens, I might examine motivation, group dynamics, and cognitive biases affecting decision-making. Through an economics lens, I might analyze incentive structures and opportunity costs. Each lens reveals different aspects of the problem, and often the most effective solutions come from combining insights from multiple models. This multi-model thinking has become one of my most valuable skills. It helps me see opportunities others miss. It helps me avoid problems others fall into. It makes me more adaptable in rapidly changing situations. Embracing uncertainty. Here's something else about cognitive flexibility that took me a while to accept. You need to get comfortable with uncertainty. Most people have this deep need for certainty. They want clear answers, definitive solutions, black and white thinking. Ambiguity makes them anxious, but reality is messy. Most important situations involve incomplete information, competing priorities, and unpredictable factors. If you need perfect certainty before making decisions, you'll be paralyzed. I used to be that person. I'd overanalyze decisions, waiting for perfect clarity that never came. I'd avoid taking action until I was absolutely sure I was making the right choice. But then I noticed something about successful people. They're really good at making decisions with incomplete information. They're comfortable saying, "I don't know for sure, but based on what I do know, here's my best judgment." They understand that waiting for perfect information often means missing opportunities, that taking action and adjusting based on feedback is usually better than endless planning. So I started practicing what I call comfortable uncertainty. When facing decisions, instead of trying to eliminate all doubt, I'd ask, what do I know? What don't I know? What's my best assessment given current information? And how can I structure this decision to limit downside risk while preserving upside potential? This approach has made me much more decisive and adaptable. I can move forward despite uncertainty. I can change course when new information emerges. I don't get paralyzed by the need for perfect answers. Chapter 5. The Curiosity Engine. Now let's talk about something that's absolutely fundamental to continuous growth. Curiosity. I know. Curiosity sounds like one of those soft, fluffy concepts that doesn't really matter. But I'm telling you, curiosity might be the single most important trait for long-term intelligence and success. Think about every major advancement in human history. It started with someone being curious enough to ask why, or what if, or how could this be different? But here's the thing about curiosity. It's not just about having interesting questions. It's about actively pursuing answers. It's about following intellectual threads wherever they lead, even when they take you outside your comfort zone. My curiosity practice. I used to think I wasn't naturally curious. I'd see people who were constantly asking questions, exploring new topics, diving deep into subjects just for fun. And I think that's just not who I am. But then I realized curiosity isn't a fixed trait. It's a skill you can develop. And more importantly, it's a habit you can cultivate. So I started doing something simple but powerful. At the end of each day, I'd write down 3 things that made me curious that day. Not just interesting things I noticed, but actual questions that I genuinely wanted to explore further. At first, this was hard. I'd struggle to think of 3 things. My brain wasn't in the habit of noticing curiosity triggers. But after a few weeks, something shifted. I started naturally paying more attention to moments of curiosity throughout the day. I'd notice when something surprised me, confused me, or sparked a question. And instead of just moving on, I'd actually pause and explore. Let me give you an example. I was in a meeting where someone mentioned that customer retention rates had suddenly dropped. Everyone else just accepted this as a data point and moved on to discussing solutions. But I got curious. Why did they drop suddenly? Was it all customer segments or specific ones? Was it correlated with any other changes in our business? What patterns might explain this? So after the meeting, I spent 30 minutes digging into the data, and I discovered something nobody else had noticed. The drop was almost entirely in customers who joined during a specific promotional period. That insight completely changed our approach to the problem. That's the power of following your curiosity. It leads to insights that others miss because they don't bother to look deeper. Asking better questions. But not all curiosity is equally valuable. Some questions lead to profound insights. Others lead nowhere. I've learned to distinguish between shallow curiosity and deep curiosity. Shallow curiosity asks, what happened? Deep curiosity asks, why did this happen? And what does it reveal about underlying principles? Shallow curiosity asks, how do I do this specific thing? Deep curiosity asks, what's the general principle here that applies to many situations? Shallow curiosity is satisfied with simple answers. Deep curiosity keeps digging until it reaches fundamental understanding. Let me show you what I mean with a technique I use called the 5 levels. When I encounter something I don't understand, I don't just ask one why question. I ask why at least 5 times, going deeper with each iteration. For example, I was curious why some people seemed naturally more successful at networking than others. Level 1. Why are some people better at networking? Because they seem more comfortable in social situations. Level 2. Why are they more comfortable? Because they're less anxious about social judgment. Level 3. Why are they less anxious? Because they don't see networking as performance or judgment. Level 4. Why don't they see it that way? Because they're genuinely interested in other people rather than focused on themselves. Level 5. What principle does this reveal? Effective networking isn't about being impressive. It's about being genuinely curious about others. See how much richer that final insight is compared to where we started? That's what deep curiosity does. It takes you beneath surface observations to fundamental principles. Lateral curiosity. Here's another dimension of curiosity that's been incredibly valuable for me. Lateral curiosity. Most people, when they're curious about something, they go deep in that one narrow topic, which is great. But lateral curiosity is about exploring connections between seemingly unrelated topics. I'll give you an example from my own experience. I was reading about ant colonies and how they solve complex problems without any central coordination. Each ant follows simple rules, but collectively they create sophisticated behavior. Then I was studying traffic patterns in cities, and I realized it's the same principle. Individual drivers following simple rules create emergent patterns of traffic flow. Then I was thinking about markets and pricing, and again, same principle. Individual buyers and sellers making local decisions create aggregate market behavior. This connection between ant colonies, traffic, and markets isn't obvious, but once you see it, it reveals something profound about how complex systems work without central control. These lateral connections are where breakthrough insights happen, because you're applying frameworks from one domain to completely different domains. I started deliberately cultivating lateral curiosity. When I learned something interesting in one field, I ask, where else might this principle apply? What seemingly unrelated things might work the same way? This practice has made me much more creative in problem solving, because I'm not limited to solutions from my own field. I can borrow ideas from biology, physics, psychology, economics, art, and combine them in novel ways. But here's something nobody talks about. All of this, everything we've discussed, microlearning, strategic information consumption, cognitive flexibility, active curiosity, none of it matters if you can't focus. And focus, deep, sustained focus, is becoming increasingly rare in our world. While everyone around you is fragmenting their attention across dozens of distractions, the ability to concentrate deeply on important work is becoming a superpower. Let me tell you about the single most transformative practice I've adopted in the last 2 years. It's not some complex system. It's actually quite simple. But it's changed everything about how I work and learn. Chapter 6, The Deep Work Revolution. 2 years ago, I was constantly busy, but rarely productive. My calendar was packed with meetings. My inbox overflowed with emails. My phone buzzed with notifications every few minutes. I felt like I was working all the time, yet I couldn't point to anything truly significant I'd accomplished. Sound familiar? Then I discovered something that completely transformed my effectiveness. The difference between shallow work and deep work. Shallow work is all those tasks that don't require much cognitive effort. Answering emails, attending meetings, scrolling through documents, responding to messages. These activities make you feel busy, but they don't move the needle on anything important. Deep work is different. It's when you're fully immersed in cognitively demanding tasks that create real value. Writing, strategic thinking, complex problem solving, learning difficult concepts. This is where breakthrough results come from. And here's what I realized. I was spending maybe 90% of my time on shallow work and only 10% on deep work. No wonder I wasn't making the progress I wanted. The attention crisis. But changing this pattern was harder than I expected, because our entire world is designed to fragment your attention. Think about it. Every app on your phone is engineered by teams of behavioral psychologists to capture and hold your attention. Social media platforms use sophisticated algorithms to keep you scrolling. News sites use sensational headlines to make you click. Email creates an artificial sense of urgency that pulls you away from important work. Your attention has become the most valuable commodity in the modern economy, and companies are waging war to capture it. I used to check my phone probably 100 times a day. I'd be working on something important, then feel that itch to check my messages. I'd be in the middle of deep thinking, then get distracted by a notification. I'd start my day planning to focus on priorities, then spend hours reacting to other people's agendas. And the worst part? I didn't even realize how much this was costing me. Because Here's what happens when you constantly fragment your attention. Your brain never reaches the depths of concentration required for truly excellent work. You're always operating in a state of what researchers call continuous partial attention. You're sort of focused on multiple things, but never fully engaged with anything. It's like trying to lift heavy weights while someone keeps tapping you on the shoulder. You can't generate real power. You can't build real strength. My deep work protocol. So I decided to completely redesign how I work. And the results have been nothing short of extraordinary. First, I identified my peak cognitive hours. For me, that's roughly 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. During these 4 hours, my mental energy is highest, my focus is sharpest, my creativity is strongest. So I made a radical decision. Those 4 hours became sacred. No meetings, no emails, no phone calls, no interruptions of any kind, just deep, focused work on my most important projects. At first, this felt impossible. People wanted meetings during those times. Urgent emails demanded responses. My phone kept buzzing, but I held firm. And you know what happened? The world didn't end. Most urgent things weren't actually urgent. People adjusted to my schedule, and the quality of work I produced during those protected hours was exponentially better than anything I'd done before. Let me give you a concrete example. I was working on a complex strategy proposal that I'd been putting off for weeks. In my old fragmented way of working, I'd probably spend 10 to 15 hours spread across multiple days, constantly interrupted, making slow progress. With my new deep work protocol, I blocked out 3 consecutive mornings. No distractions, full focus. I completed the entire proposal in about 8 hours. But more importantly, the quality was dramatically higher. The thinking was clearer, the structure was more logical, the insights were deeper. That's the power of deep work. You don't just get more done, you do better work. Creating the conditions for focus. But blocking out time isn't enough. You need to create an environment that supports sustained concentration. I learned this the hard way. I'd block out time for deep work, then sit at my desk with my phone next to me, email open in another tab, Slack running in the background, and I'd wonder why I couldn't focus. It's like trying to sleep with bright lights and loud music. Your brain can't shift into a focused state when it's constantly being pulled in different directions. So I started treating my deep work sessions like important appointments with myself. I'd literally prepare for them. Before each session, I'd turn my phone to airplane mode and put it in another room. Not just on silent, in another room. Because even seeing my phone creates a subtle cognitive load. I'd close all browser tabs except the ones directly related to my task. No email, no social media, no news sites, just the specific tools I needed for that work. I'd use website blockers to prevent myself from automatically navigating to distracting sites out of habit. Because I realized that a lot of my distraction was unconscious. I'd be writing something, hit a challenging part, and before I knew it, I'd be on Twitter. Not because I consciously decided to check Twitter, but because my brain was seeking the easy dopamine hit of novelty over the harder work of deep thinking. I'd also optimize my physical environment. Good lighting, comfortable temperature, noise-canceling headphones playing focused music or white noise, a clean desk with only the materials I needed for that session. These might seem like small details, but they add up. They create an environment where your brain can naturally settle into deep focus. The attention muscle. Here's something else I learned. Your ability to focus deeply is like a muscle. It atrophies with disuse and strengthens with practice. When I first started trying to do deep work, I could barely maintain focus for 30 minutes. My mind would wander. I'd feel restless. I'd start craving distractions. But I treated it like training. Just like you wouldn't expect to run a marathon without building up your endurance, you can't expect to focus deeply for hours without building that capacity. So, I started small. 30-minute focus sessions with short breaks, then 45 minutes, then 60 minutes, gradually building up my concentration stamina, and something amazing happened. Not only could I focus for longer periods, but the quality of my focus improved. I could go deeper into problems. I could hold more complex ideas in my head simultaneously. I could make connections I would have missed with fragmented attention. This has honestly been one of the most valuable skills I've developed, because in a world where most people are losing their ability to concentrate, the ability to do deep focused work is becoming increasingly rare and valuable. Chapter 7. Systems Thinking and Mental Models. All right, let's shift gears and talk about something that's transformed how I understand and navigate complexity. Systems thinking. Most people think in terms of simple cause and effect. If I do X, then Y will happen. And sometimes that's true. But most important situations in life aren't that simple. Real life involves complex systems where multiple factors interact in non-obvious ways, where small changes can have large effects, where the same action can produce different results depending on context, where solving one problem can create new problems elsewhere. I'll give you an example from my own experience that really drove this home. The team productivity paradox. A few years ago, I was managing a team that wasn't hitting its targets. The obvious solution seemed to be make people work harder, push for more hours, set more aggressive deadlines, increase pressure. So, that's what I did. And initially, productivity did increase. Problem solved, right? Wrong. Within 2 months, we had 3 people quit. Team morale crashed, quality of work declined, mistakes increased, and ultimately, productivity ended up lower than when we started. What happened? I'd been thinking in terms of simple cause and effect. More pressure equals more productivity. But I wasn't seeing the system. When I stepped back and looked at the bigger picture, I realized there were multiple feedback loops at play. Increased pressure led to stress, which reduced creativity and problem-solving ability. That made work take longer, which increased pressure further. Vicious cycle. Higher stress led to burnout, which led to turnover, which reduced team capacity, which increased pressure on remaining members. Another vicious cycle. Lower morale reduced collaboration, which made work less efficient, which made targets harder to hit, which lowered morale further. Yet another vicious cycle. I wasn't seeing any of this because I was only looking at immediate direct effects. I wasn't seeing the system-level dynamics. Once I understood the actual system, I completely changed my approach. Instead of increasing pressure, I focused on removing obstacles, improving processes, and building team capability. And guess what? Productivity increased sustainably without burning people out. Seeing patterns instead of events. This experience taught me something crucial. You need to look beyond individual events to see underlying patterns and structures. Most people get stuck at the event level. Something happens, they react to it, move on. Another thing happens, they react to that. They're constantly firefighting, never understanding why the same problems keep emerging. But when you develop systems thinking, you start seeing patterns. You notice that this problem isn't isolated. It's part of a recurring dynamic. And that dynamic is being driven by some underlying structure or set of relationships. Let me give you a different example. I used to struggle with time management. I'd have periods where I felt productive and in control, followed by periods where I felt overwhelmed and behind. This cycle repeated over and over. At the event level, I'd just react. I'm behind on work, better stay late tonight. I have too many commitments, need to work harder. But I wasn't seeing the pattern. Once I zoomed out, I realized what was happening. I was saying yes to too many things during my productive periods. That would lead to overcommitment, which would lead to overwhelm, which would reduce my productivity, which would make me more selective about commitments, which would reduce my workload, which would make me feel productive again, and the cycle would repeat. The underlying structure was my decision-making about commitments was reactive rather than strategic. I wasn't maintaining sustainable boundaries. I was oscillating between two extremes. Understanding this pattern allowed me to break the cycle by maintaining more consistent boundaries regardless of how productive I felt in the moment. Building your mental model library. Systems thinking is powerful, but it's even more powerful when combined with a library of mental models. Mental models are basically frameworks for understanding how things work. They're simplified representations of reality that help you make sense of complex situations and predict outcomes. I started deliberately collecting mental models from different disciplines, and I found that the same patterns show up across wildly different domains. For instance, there's a concept in physics called the path of least resistance. Water flows downhill because that's the easiest path. Electricity follows the path of least resistance through a circuit. But this same principle applies to human behavior. People generally take the path of least resistance. If you want to change behavior, don't just tell people what to do. Change the structure so the desired behavior is the path of least resistance. Or consider the concept of network effects from technology. A platform becomes more valuable as more people use it. That's why Facebook and other social networks grew so explosively once they reached critical mass. But network effects apply to knowledge too. The more concepts you understand, the easier it becomes to learn new concepts, because you have more things to connect them to. Learning compounds on itself. Or think about the principle of compound interest from finance. Small amounts invested consistently over time grow exponentially. But this applies to way more than money. It applies to skills, relationships, health, knowledge. Small, consistent actions compound into extraordinary results. Once you understand these patterns, you start seeing them everywhere, and that gives you enormous predictive power. Chapter 8. Decision-making under uncertainty. Now let's talk about something that affects literally every outcome in your life: how you make decisions. Most people make decisions based on gut feeling, emotional impulse, or whatever seems right in the moment. And sometimes that works. But often it leads to predictable errors and missed opportunities. I used to make decisions this way, and I'd be frustrated when things didn't work out, not understanding why I kept making the same mistakes. Then I learned about cognitive biases. These are systematic errors in thinking that our brains are prone to. And once you understand them, you realize your intuition isn't as reliable as you think. The bias problem. Let me tell you about a decision I made that perfectly illustrates confirmation bias. I was considering investing in a startup. I liked the founders, I was excited about the product, and I really wanted it to be a good investment, so I researched the company. But here's what I didn't realize at the time. I was only looking for information that confirmed my initial positive impression. When I found positive indicators, I gave them a lot of weight. When I encountered red flags, I rationalized them away or gave them less importance. I saw what I wanted to see, and I invested. The startup failed within 18 months, and in retrospect, the warning signs were obvious. But I'd been filtering reality through my bias. That experience taught me something valuable. You can't trust your brain to evaluate information objectively. You need systems and processes that compensate for your built-in biases. Now, before making important decisions, I deliberately seek out disconfirming evidence. I ask, what information would prove me wrong? Who would disagree with this decision and why? I actually role-play the opposing perspective. I genuinely try to argue against my own position as strongly as I can. And often, I discover problems I hadn't noticed before. The pre-mortem technique. Here's another decision-making tool that's been incredibly valuable: the pre-mortem. This is a technique where you imagine that a decision has been made and implemented, and it failed spectacularly. Then you work backward to figure out what went wrong. For example, let's say I'm considering launching a new product. Instead of just focusing on how it might succeed, I imagine it's 1 year from now. The product launch was a disaster. Why did it fail? This immediately unlocks different thinking. Instead of defending the decision, I'm analyzing potential failure modes, and I often discover risks I hadn't considered. Maybe the market wasn't as big as we thought. Maybe our production costs were higher than projected. Maybe a competitor launched something better first. Maybe we couldn't hire the talent we needed. Maybe legal regulations changed. Each of these becomes something I can now investigate or plan for. The pre-mortem helps me make better decisions by forcing me to consider what could go wrong before committing resources. The reversibility framework. Here's another framework I use constantly, distinguishing between reversible and irreversible decisions. Some decisions are easy to reverse. You can try something, see if it works, and change course if needed. These decisions should be made quickly, with minimal analysis. Other decisions are hard or impossible to reverse. They lock you into a path with significant switching costs. These decisions deserve much more careful thought. I used to treat all decisions the same, spending excessive time on minor decisions while rushing major ones. Now, I calibrate my decision-making process to the reversibility of the decision. For reversible decisions, I use what I call the two-way door approach. I make a quick decision, implement it, see what happens, and adjust if needed. The cost of getting it wrong is low because I can always go back through the door. For irreversible decisions, I use the one-way door approach. I invest much more time in analysis, gather multiple perspectives, run small experiments if possible, and only commit when I have high confidence. This framework has saved me countless hours of unnecessary deliberation while helping me avoid costly mistakes on major decisions. Expected value thinking. Here's one more decision-making concept that's transformed my thinking: expected value. Most people evaluate decisions based on the most likely outcome, but that's not the whole picture. You also need to consider the magnitude of different outcomes and their probabilities. Let me give you a simple example. Imagine two investment opportunities. Option A, 90% chance of making $1,000, 10% chance of losing $500. Option B, 50% chance of making $5,000, 50% chance of losing $1,000. Most people would choose option A because it feels safer, higher probability of success. But if you calculate expected value, option A, 0.9 times $1,000 plus 0.1 times minus $500 equals $900 minus $50 equals $850. Option B, 0.5 times $5,000 plus 0.5 times minus $1,000 equals $2,500 minus $500 equals $2,000. Option B has more than twice the expected value of option A, even though it feels riskier. Now, this doesn't mean you should always take the higher expected value option. Risk tolerance matters, personal circumstances matter, but you should at least understand what you're trading off. I started applying expected value thinking to all kinds of decisions, not just financial ones. Career moves, relationship investments, learning priorities, time allocation. It helps me make more rational choices instead of being swayed by how decisions feel in the moment. Chapter 9. Building your learning network. All right, here's something that took me way too long to understand. You don't have to figure everything out alone. I used to be that person who thought asking for help was a sign of weakness, who believed I should be able to solve every problem independently, who was reluctant to admit when I didn't know something. This mindset was incredibly limiting because no matter how smart you are, you can't possibly have expertise in everything, but you can build relationships with people who have complementary knowledge and skills. The network effect on intelligence. Think about it like this. Let's say you're reasonably knowledgeable in 3 areas. That's valuable. But if you build genuine relationships with 10 people who each have deep expertise in different areas, you've effectively multiplied your intellectual capacity. When you encounter a problem, you don't just have your own knowledge to draw on. You have access to the knowledge and insights of your entire network. I experienced this firsthand when I was working on a complex business challenge. I knew the basics of what needed to happen, but I lacked expertise in several critical areas. In my old mindset, I would have struggled alone, probably making costly mistakes. Instead, I reached out to people in my network. I talked to someone with expertise in regulatory compliance about potential legal issues. I consulted someone with marketing experience about positioning and messaging. I asked someone with operational experience about implementation challenges. I connected with someone who'd done something similar before and learned from their experience. Each conversation probably saved me weeks of trial and error, and the final solution was far better than anything I could have developed alone. That's when I realized building a strong learning network isn't just nice to have. It's essential for operating at a high level in a complex world. Authentic relationship building. But here's the key. Effective networking isn't about collecting contacts or being transactional. It's about building genuine relationships based on mutual value and respect. I used to approach networking all wrong. I'd go to events, collect business cards, add people on LinkedIn, and then nothing. No real relationship. No real value exchange. Then I learned a better approach. Focus on giving before receiving. Instead of thinking, what can this person do for me? I started asking, how can I be helpful to this person? Maybe I could make a valuable introduction. Maybe I could share relevant information or resources. Maybe I could offer a perspective they hadn't considered. And something interesting happened. When you consistently provide value to others without expecting immediate return, people remember you. They appreciate you. And they naturally want to reciprocate when they can help you. But more than that, you build real relationships instead of transactional connections. And real relationships are far more valuable over the long term. Strategic diversity. Here's another important principle. Seek diversity in your network. Most people naturally build networks of people similar to themselves. Same industry, same background, same perspectives. This creates an echo chamber where everyone reinforces the same ideas. But the most valuable networks are diverse. Different industries, different backgrounds, different ways of thinking. I deliberately cultivated relationships with people outside my field. Artists, scientists, entrepreneurs, educators, engineers, people from different countries and cultures, people at different life stages. These diverse perspectives have been invaluable. They help me avoid blind spots. They expose me to ideas I'd never encounter in my professional bubble. They challenge my assumptions and expand my thinking. Some of my best insights have come from conversations with people who knew nothing about my field but could apply principles from their own domain in unexpected ways. But here's something that all of this, the learning, the focus, the systems thinking, the decision-making, the networking, all of it depends on one critical factor: resilience. The ability to keep going when things get hard, to bounce back from setbacks, to maintain growth even when faced with obstacles and failures. Because let me tell you something, nobody talks about enough. The path to becoming smarter, more capable, more successful, it's not smooth. There will be failures. There will be setbacks. There will be moments where you question everything. And what separates people who ultimately succeed from those who give up is how they handle those moments. Let me share what I've learned about building resilience. Chapter 10. The Anti-Fragile Mindset. Let me tell you about the lowest point in my professional life. 3 years ago, I launched what I thought was a brilliant project. I'd spent months planning, invested significant resources, convinced my team it would be transformative. I was certain it would succeed. It failed spectacularly. Not only did we miss our targets, but we lost money, damaged client relationships, and I lost credibility with my leadership. I remember sitting in my car after the post-mortem meeting, feeling like a complete failure, and in that moment, I had a choice. I could let this defeat define me, confirm my worst fears about my abilities, and play it safe from then on. Or I could treat this as expensive but valuable education. I chose the second path, and that choice changed everything. Failure as feedback. Here's what I've learned about failure. It's not the opposite of success. It's part of the path to success. Think about every person you admire, every successful entrepreneur, leader, artist, athlete. They've all failed more times than most people have even tried. The difference isn't that they somehow avoid failure. It's that they've developed a completely different relationship with failure. They see failure as information, as feedback, as tuition paid for valuable lessons. After that project failed, I did something I'd never done before. Instead of trying to forget about it and move on, I conducted a thorough analysis. What assumptions did I make that turned out to be wrong? What signals did I miss that should have warned me? What skills or knowledge gaps contributed to the failure? What could I do differently next time? I filled pages with honest, brutal analysis. And you know what? I learned more from that single failure than I had from my previous 3 successes combined. Because success can teach you what works in specific circumstances. But failure shows you the boundaries, the pitfalls, the gaps in your thinking. Now, I'm not saying you should seek out failure. That would be ridiculous. But you should be willing to take calculated risks where the potential for learning and growth outweighs the cost of potential failure. Building stress capacity. Here's another insight about resilience that completely changed my perspective. Stress isn't always bad. In fact, the right kind of stress is essential for growth. Think about physical fitness. When you lift weights, you're literally creating micro tears in your muscle fibers. That sounds bad, right? But it's those micro tears that trigger your body to rebuild the muscle stronger than before. Your mental and emotional resilience works the same way. When you face challenging situations, make difficult decisions, navigate conflict, you're building psychological muscle. The key is finding the right level of challenge. Too little stress, and you don't grow. Too much stress, and you get overwhelmed and break down. I started deliberately putting myself in situations that stretched me but didn't break me, taking on projects slightly beyond my current capability, having difficult conversations I'd previously avoided, making decisions with incomplete information. Each of these experiences was uncomfortable, but each one also expanded my capacity to handle complexity and uncertainty. It's like gradually increasing the weight you lift at the gym. You don't jump from lifting 50 pounds to 200 pounds. You progressively increase the load as your capacity grows. The recovery principle. But here's the critical part that a lot of people miss. Growth doesn't happen during stress. It happens during recovery. When you lift weights, your muscles don't grow stronger while you're in the gym. They grow stronger during rest periods when your body repairs and rebuilds. The same principle applies to mental and emotional resilience. You need recovery periods. You need time to process experiences, integrate lessons, and restore your capacity. I used to pride myself on being constantly busy, always pushing, never stopping. I thought rest was for weak people. That recovery time was wasted time. I was wrong, spectacularly wrong. Without adequate recovery, you just accumulate stress and damage without the corresponding growth. It's like lifting weights every single day without rest days. You don't get stronger, you get injured. Now, I'm much more strategic about both stress and recovery. I'll take on intense challenges, but I also protect recovery time. I make sure I'm sleeping well, exercising regularly, taking actual breaks from work. And paradoxically, this has made me more productive, not less, because I can operate at a higher intensity when it matters, knowing that I have recovery built into my system. Chapter 11. Emotional Intelligence in Action. All right, let's talk about something that's often overlooked in discussions about intelligence: emotions. For a long time, I thought emotions were obstacles to clear thinking, that the ideal was to be purely rational, making decisions based only on logic and facts. But I've learned that emotions aren't obstacles to intelligence. They're an essential component of intelligence. Let me explain what I mean. Emotions as information. Your emotions provide crucial information about your values, your needs, and potential consequences of your choices. Think about it. That feeling of anxiety when considering a decision. It's your brain's way of flagging potential risks. That feeling of excitement about an opportunity. It's signaling alignment with your values and goals. That feeling of frustration in a relationship. It's indicating that some need isn't being met. The problem isn't having emotions. The problem is not understanding them or being controlled by them. I used to ignore my emotional responses, thinking I was being rational, but I was actually missing important signals. For example, I once took a job that looked perfect on paper. Great title, good salary, prestigious company. Logically, it made sense, but I had this nagging feeling of unease that I couldn't quite explain. I ignored that feeling and took the job. Within 6 months, I was miserable. The culture was toxic, the work was unfulfilling, and I realized that my emotional unease had been picking up on subtle signals during the interview process that my logical mind had dismissed. That experience taught me emotions are data. Not the only data, but important data that shouldn't be ignored. Now, when I have strong emotional responses, I don't dismiss them. But I also don't let them control me. Instead, I get curious about them. Why am I feeling anxious about this decision? What specific risks am I concerned about? Why am I excited about this opportunity? What aspects align with my values? Why am I frustrated in this situation? What needs aren't being met? This curiosity about my emotions helps me extract the useful information they contain while avoiding reactive decisions based purely on feeling, self-regulation in practice. But understanding your emotions is only half the equation. The other half is managing them effectively. I'm not talking about suppressing emotions or pretending they don't exist. I'm talking about creating space between feeling and reaction. Here's a technique that's been transformative for me: the pause. When I feel a strong emotional impulse, especially anger or frustration, I've trained myself to pause before responding. Just a few seconds, sometimes longer if the situation is particularly charged. During that pause, I do 3 things. First, I name the emotion. I'm feeling angry right now. This simple act of labeling actually reduces the intensity of the emotion. There's neuroscience behind this. When you verbally label an emotion, it activates your prefrontal cortex and reduces activity in your amygdala, the emotional center of your brain. Second, I identify what triggered it. I'm angry because I feel disrespected, or I'm frustrated because I feel my time is being wasted. This helps me understand what's really going on beneath the surface emotion. Third, I choose my response. Instead of reacting impulsively, I consciously decide how I want to respond based on my values and goals, not just my immediate feelings. Let me give you a real example. I was in a meeting where a colleague publicly criticized work my team had done. My immediate emotional response was anger and defensiveness. I wanted to push back, defend my team, maybe even criticize their work in return. But I paused, named the emotion, identified that I felt protective of my team and concerned about how this criticism might affect their confidence. Then I chose a different response. Instead of getting defensive, I acknowledged the valid points in the criticism, explained the context and constraints we were working under, and invited the colleague to collaborate on solutions. The result? We actually solved the problem together. The colleague felt heard, rather than attacked. My team saw me handle criticism professionally, and I didn't damage a working relationship by reacting defensively. That's emotional regulation in action, not suppressing feelings, but managing them effectively. Empathy as a superpower. Now, let's talk about the other side of emotional intelligence, understanding and connecting with other people's emotions. Empathy has become a bit of a buzzword, and I think that's actually diluted what it really means and why it's so powerful. Real empathy isn't just about being nice or agreeable. It's about genuinely understanding how other people see the world, what motivates them, what concerns them. And this understanding gives you incredible leverage in almost every situation. Let me share an example. I was trying to get buy-in for a major change in our department's processes. Logically, the benefits were clear. Efficiency would improve, costs would decrease, quality would increase. But I kept hitting resistance from certain team members, and initially I was frustrated. Why can't they see that this is obviously better? Then I actually sat down and talked to them, not to convince them, but to understand their perspective. And I discovered their resistance wasn't about logic. They were concerned that the new process would eliminate their specialized knowledge, making them less valuable. They worried about job security. Once I understood this, I could address the real issue. I showed them how the new process would actually create opportunities for them to develop new skills and take on more strategic responsibilities. I involved them in the implementation so they felt ownership rather than having change imposed on them. Their resistance melted away, not because I convinced them with logic, but because I addressed their underlying concerns. This is why emotional intelligence is so powerful. When you understand what people really care about, what they're worried about, what motivates them, you can communicate in ways that actually resonate. Chapter 12, The Art of Influence, which brings me to communication and influence. Because all the intelligence, knowledge, and insight in the world doesn't matter if you can't effectively communicate and influence others. I used to think that good ideas would sell themselves, that if something was logical and beneficial, people would naturally support it. But reality doesn't work that way. The world is full of good ideas that never get implemented because nobody could effectively advocate for them. Framing is everything. Here's something that took me years to understand. How you frame information matters as much as the information itself. The same idea can be presented in ways that either inspire action or create resistance, depending entirely on how you frame it. Let me give you a concrete example. I needed to convince leadership to invest in team training. I initially framed it as, we need to spend $50,000 on training programs. The response? Resistance, concerns about budget, questions about ROI. Then I reframed it. We're currently losing about $200,000 annually due to inefficiencies that targeted training could address. For a $50,000 investment, we can recoup that loss and improve team capability long term. Same information, different frame. And the response was completely different. Instead of seeing it as a cost, they saw it as an investment with clear returns. That's the power of framing. Now I think carefully about how I present ideas. Gain versus loss framing. People respond more strongly to avoiding losses than to achieving equivalent gains. So sometimes I frame things in terms of what we'll miss out on if we don't act, rather than what we'll gain if we do. Short-term versus long-term framing. Some audiences care more about immediate results, others about long-term vision. I adjust my framing based on who I'm talking to. Individual versus collective framing. Some people are motivated by personal benefit, others by collective good. I frame accordingly. The key is understanding your audience and choosing frames that align with their values and concerns. Storytelling that moves people. But here's an even more powerful communication tool: storytelling. Facts tell, but stories sell. Our brains are wired to understand and remember stories far better than abstract information. I used to present ideas with data, logic, and bullet points, and people would nod along, maybe even agree, but rarely take action. Then I started using stories to illustrate my points, and the response was completely different. Instead of saying, our customer service needs improvement because our response times are slow, I'd tell a specific story. Last week, I talked to a customer who'd been trying to get help for 3 days. She was frustrated, ready to leave us for a competitor. And this wasn't an isolated case. That story creates emotional resonance in a way that statistics never could. It makes the problem real and urgent. The best stories follow a simple structure: a relatable character facing a challenge or opportunity who encounters obstacles, learns important lessons, and achieves a resolution that demonstrates the key point. This structure works because it mirrors how we naturally process information. It creates tension and resolution. It engages both emotion and logic. Now, I don't make up stories. That would be dishonest and manipulative. But I collect real examples, case studies, and anecdotes that illustrate the points I want to make. And I've noticed something interesting. People remember my stories long after they've forgotten my data. Listening as a competitive advantage. But here's something most people get wrong about communication. They think it's primarily about talking, about presenting, about convincing. The truth? The most influential people are usually the best listeners. Real listening, not just waiting for your turn to talk, is incredibly rare and incredibly powerful. When you truly listen to someone, they feel heard and valued. That creates trust and openness. They become more receptive to your ideas because you've demonstrated respect for theirs. But most people don't really listen. They're formulating their response while the other person is still talking. They're thinking about how to counter arguments or insert their own points. I used to be this way. In conversations, I'd be planning what to say next instead of fully absorbing what was being said. Then I learned a technique called active listening. It's simple in concept, but requires practice. First, I focus completely on understanding the other person's perspective, not evaluating it, not judging it, not preparing my response, just understanding. Second, I reflect back what I heard. So what you're saying is, this serves two purposes. It confirms I understood correctly, and it shows the other person I was actually listening. Third, I ask clarifying questions. Can you tell me more about, or what do you mean by? This deepens understanding and shows genuine interest. Only then do I offer my own perspective. And by this point, I usually have much better insight into how to frame my ideas in ways that will resonate. This approach has transformed my professional relationships. People actively seek out my input because they know I'll actually listen to them. They're more open to my ideas because I've demonstrated openness to theirs. And often, by truly listening, I discover that my initial perspective was incomplete or wrong. The conversation improves both of our understanding rather than just being a competition to see whose viewpoint wins. Chapter 13. Creative Problem Solving. Now let's talk about something that separates exceptional thinkers from average ones: the ability to solve problems creatively. Most people approach problems with a fixed toolkit. They try the same solutions they've always used, and when those don't work, they try them harder or give up. But creative problem solvers see challenges as opportunities to think differently. Reframing the problem. Here's the first principle of creative problem solving. The way you define a problem largely determines what solutions are possible. I learned this lesson when I was trying to solve what seemed like a staffing problem. We didn't have enough people to handle our workload, and hiring wasn't an option due to budget constraints. The obvious problem definition was, how do we get more people? But that framing limited my options. If hiring wasn't possible, I was stuck. Then I reframed the problem. How do we accomplish what needs to be done with the resources we have? This opened up completely different solutions. Could we automate certain tasks? Could we eliminate work that wasn't actually creating value? Could we partner with other departments to share resources? Could we train people to work more efficiently? Could we prioritize differently to focus on highest impact work? None of these solutions were visible when I was fixated on getting more people. But reframing the problem revealed a whole landscape of possibilities. Now, whenever I face a challenging problem, I deliberately reframe it multiple ways. Instead of, how do I solve X? I ask, what would make X irrelevant? Instead of, how do we do this better? I ask, should we be doing this at all? Instead of, how do we succeed? Despite this constraint, I ask, How could this constraint actually help us? These different frames reveal different solution spaces. Borrowing ideas across domains. Here's another powerful creative thinking technique, looking at how similar problems are solved in completely different fields. Some of my best solutions have come from applying principles from one domain to challenges in a completely different domain. For example, I was struggling with how to make our team meetings more productive. Traditional meeting improvement approaches weren't working. Then I thought about how improv comedy works. In improv, there's a rule called yes and. Instead of shutting down ideas, you build on them. Instead of criticizing, you add to what's been said. I introduced this principle to our meetings. Instead of immediately pointing out problems with suggestions, we practiced building on them first. Yes, and we could also, or yes, and that reminds me of. The effect was dramatic. People became more willing to share ideas because they weren't immediately shot down. The quality of our collaborative thinking improved significantly. That solution came from comedy improv, not business management. But the principle transferred perfectly. Now, I actively look for analogous problems in different fields. How do scientists design experiments? Can that approach help me test business hypotheses? How do chefs develop recipes? Can that process inform how we develop products? How do athletes train? Can those principles apply to skill development in my field? This cross-pollination of ideas leads to novel solutions that wouldn't emerge from staying within a single domain. The power of constraints. Here's something counterintuitive I've learned. Constraints can actually enhance creativity rather than limiting it. When you have unlimited resources and options, it's easy to get overwhelmed and paralyzed. But when you have clear constraints, they force you to think more creatively within those boundaries. I experienced this when I had to deliver a major project with a fraction of the budget I'd initially requested. My first reaction was frustration. How could I possibly do this with such limited resources? But once I accepted the constraint, something interesting happened. I became much more creative. I found free tools instead of expensive software. I leveraged existing relationships instead of hiring consultants. I simplified the scope to focus on essential features. The final result was actually better than my original plan. The constraints forced me to be more strategic and efficient. They eliminated unnecessary complexity. Now, when facing constraints, instead of seeing them as obstacles, I ask, how might this constraint lead to a better solution? Limited budget? Forces efficiency and creativity? Tight timeline? Forces prioritization and focus? Small team? Forces automation and leverage? The constraint becomes a creative catalyst rather than a barrier. But here's something I need to be honest about. Everything we've discussed, all these strategies and techniques, they only matter if you can consistently implement them. And consistent implementation requires something that most people struggle with: managing your energy and optimizing your performance over time. Because the reality is, your mental capacity isn't constant. Some hours you're sharp, focused, capable of complex thinking. Other hours you're foggy, distracted, barely functional. And if you don't understand how to optimize your energy and performance, all the intelligence and skill in the world won't help you. Let me share what I have learned about sustainable high performance. Chapter 14, The Energy Optimization System. Let me tell you about the wake-up call that changed how I think about productivity. 2 years ago, I was working insane hours, 12, 14, sometimes 16-hour days. I was proud of my work ethic. I wore my exhaustion like a badge of honor. And then one day, I couldn't remember a conversation I'd had 3 hours earlier. I was in a meeting, and someone referenced something I'd said earlier that morning. I had absolutely no recollection of it. That scared me. Not just the memory lapse, but what it represented. I was so depleted that my brain literally couldn't form proper memories anymore. That's when I realized time management is important, but energy management is critical. You can have all the time in the world, but if you're operating at 30% capacity, you're not going to accomplish anything meaningful. An hour of focused work when you're energized is worth 10 hours of depleted effort. Understanding your energy rhythms. Here's the first thing I learned. Your cognitive capacity isn't constant throughout the day. It follows predictable patterns. Most people have peak mental energy in the morning, a dip after lunch, a recovery in mid-afternoon, and another decline in the evening. But everyone's pattern is slightly different. I started tracking my energy levels throughout the day for 2 weeks. Every hour, I'd note whether I felt sharp, average, or foggy, whether tasks felt easy or difficult, whether I was focused or distracted. The patterns that emerged were eye-opening. My absolute peak was between 9 a.m. and 12 p.m. During these hours, I could tackle complex problems, do creative work, make important decisions with relative ease. After lunch, around 2 to 3 p.m., I hit a significant dip. During this time, even simple tasks felt harder. My focus was scattered. My thinking was slower. Then I'd have a smaller recovery around 4 to 5 p.m. before declining again in the evening. Once I understood this pattern, I completely restructured how I worked. Strategic task allocation. I started aligning my tasks with my energy levels, and the impact was immediate and dramatic. During my peak hours, 9 a.m. to 12 p.m., I only did high-value, cognitively demanding work. Strategic thinking, important writing, complex problem-solving, key decisions, no meetings, no email, no administrative tasks. Just the work that mattered most and required my best thinking. During my low-energy periods, 2 to 3 p.m., I'd do routine tasks that didn't require much cognitive power. Answering emails, organizing files, scheduling, light reading. Sometimes I'd even go for a walk or do some easy exercise to help recovery. During my moderate energy periods, early afternoon and late afternoon, I'd do collaborative work, meetings, discussions, things that benefited from interaction but didn't require peak individual performance. This simple change probably doubled my effective output because I was doing my most important work when I was at my best instead of scattering it randomly throughout the day. The foundation, sleep. But here's the thing about energy optimization. It's not just about how you allocate tasks during the day. It's about building the foundation that makes high energy possible. And the foundation of that foundation is sleep. I used to treat sleep as optional, something I'd sacrifice when I needed more time to work. I'd brag about functioning on 5 or 6 hours of sleep. I was an idiot. The research on this is absolutely clear. Sleep deprivation is devastating for cognitive performance. It impairs decision-making, reduces creativity, weakens memory formation, increases emotional reactivity, and literally makes you dumber. And the scary part? When you're sleep deprived, you don't even realize how impaired you are. You feel like you're functioning normally when you're actually operating at a fraction of your capacity. I started prioritizing sleep. Not just time in bed, but quality sleep. I established a consistent sleep schedule. I optimized my bedroom environment. I developed a wind-down routine. The difference was night and day. Problems that seemed intractable the night before suddenly had obvious solutions in the morning. My mood improved. My focus sharpened. My energy stabilized. I literally became smarter just by sleeping properly. Physical energy as mental fuel. Exercise is the other non-negotiable foundation. I used to think of exercise as separate from intellectual performance, something you did for physical health, but not really relevant to mental capacity. Wrong again. Exercise has profound effects on cognitive function. It increases blood flow to the brain, promotes the growth of new brain cells, improves mood, reduces stress, and actually makes you smarter. The research shows that people who exercise regularly perform better on cognitive tests, have better memory, and show slower cognitive decline with age. But beyond the long-term benefits, exercise has immediate effects on your daily energy and focus. I started incorporating movement throughout my day. Not just formal exercise sessions, but regular movement breaks. Every 90 minutes or so, I'd stand up, stretch, walk around, maybe do some light exercise. These brief movement breaks completely changed my ability to sustain focus throughout the day. Instead of hitting progressive mental fog as the day went on, I could maintain much more consistent performance. Nutrition as cognitive fuel. And then there's nutrition. What you eat directly affects how well your brain functions. I used to eat lunch without thinking about it, usually something quick and convenient, often heavy and carb-loaded. Then I'd wonder why I felt foggy and unproductive every afternoon. Once I understood that my post-lunch energy crash was largely diet-driven, I completely changed my approach. I started eating lighter lunches focused on protein and vegetables rather than heavy carbs. I stayed hydrated throughout the day. I avoided sugar crashes by keeping blood sugar stable. The afternoon energy crash that I'd experienced for years, it essentially disappeared. These might seem like basic, obvious things. Sleep, exercise, nutrition. But most people, including past me, don't actually optimize them because they seem too simple to matter. But they're the foundation. Without them, all the productivity hacks and time management systems in the world won't help you. Chapter 15, Integration and Implementation. All right, we've covered a lot of ground together: growth mindset, microlearning, strategic information consumption, cognitive flexibility, curiosity, deep work, systems thinking, decision-making, learning networks, resilience, emotional intelligence, communication, creative problem-solving, energy management. But here's the crucial question. How do you actually integrate all of this into your life? Because knowledge without application is just entertainment, and trying to implement everything at once is a recipe for overwhelm and failure. The compound principle. Here's what I've learned about sustainable change. Start small, build momentum, let habits compound. Most people approach self-improvement backwards. They try to completely transform their lives overnight. New diet, new exercise routine, new learning habits, new productivity system, all at once. And they last maybe 2 weeks before burning out and giving up. I've done this myself more times than I can count. Big, ambitious plans that collapse under their own weight. Then I discovered a better approach. The principle of marginal gains. Instead of trying to make massive changes all at once, focus on small, sustainable improvements that compound over time. Let me give you a concrete example of how I've actually implemented what I've shared with you. My actual implementation path. I didn't start by trying to do everything. I started with one thing: 15 minutes of focused learning each morning. That's it. Just 15 minutes. Small enough to be sustainable, specific enough to actually do. I did this consistently for a month. Just 15 minutes every single morning before checking email or starting work. Reading articles, listening to podcasts, watching educational videos. After a month, it felt natural, habitual. I didn't have to force myself anymore. It was just part of my morning routine. Then I added something else, a weekly review where I'd reflect on what I learned that week and how I might apply it. Just 20 minutes every Sunday, looking back at my notes, identifying key insights, thinking about applications. Another month of consistency until this became habitual too. Then I added deep work blocks. Started with just 2 hours twice a week. Protected time for focused work on important projects. Gradually built this up over months until I had a full deep work protocol. Then I added the energy optimization strategies. Sleep consistency. Movement breaks. Better nutrition. Each addition was small. Each was given time to become habitual before adding the next thing. And here's what happened. These small habits compounded. The learning habit made me more knowledgeable, which made my work more valuable, which created opportunities. The deep work blocks dramatically increased my output. The energy optimization made everything else easier. Over a year, these small changes created a complete transformation in my capabilities and results. But at no point did it feel overwhelming, because I was only focused on 1 or 2 new habits at a time. Choosing your starting point. So here's what I want you to do. Not try to implement everything from this entire conversation. That would be crazy. Instead, choose one thing, one principle, one practice, one habit that resonated most strongly with you. Maybe it's 10 minutes of daily learning, a weekly reflection practice, protecting one deep work block per week, asking better questions, seeking out opposing viewpoints, conducting pre-mortems on important decisions, building one new relationship per month, practicing the pause before reacting emotionally, reframing one fixed mindset belief, optimizing your sleep. Whatever it is, commit to just that one thing for 30 days. Not perfectly. Perfectionism is the enemy of consistency, but consistently enough that it starts becoming natural. Track it somehow. A simple check mark on a calendar, a note in your phone, whatever works for you. And after 30 days, after that habit feels established, add one more thing. The identity shift. But here's something even more important than specific habits. The identity shift that makes everything else easier. Every action you take is a vote for the type of person you want to become. When you spend 15 minutes learning, you're voting for being a learner. When you ask thoughtful questions, you're voting for being curious. When you seek out challenges, you're voting for being someone who grows. When you bounce back from setbacks, you're voting for being resilient. These votes add up, and over time, they don't just change what you do. They change who you are. I used to see myself as someone who wasn't naturally smart, wasn't naturally creative, wasn't naturally good at learning. These beliefs were prison cells. But as I started taking actions that contradicted these beliefs, something shifted. I started seeing evidence that contradicted my old identity. I'm not good at learning became harder to believe when I was consistently learning new things. I'm not creative became harder to believe when I was solving problems creatively. I'm not resilient became harder to believe when I was bouncing back from setbacks. Eventually, my identity shifted, not through positive thinking or affirmations, but through accumulated evidence from my own actions. Now, I genuinely see myself as someone who learns continuously, thinks creatively, and grows from challenges. Not because I'm special or naturally talented, but because I've consistently taken actions that reinforce that identity. And here's the beautiful part. Once your identity shifts, the behaviors become much easier. You don't have to force yourself to learn when you see yourself as a learner. You don't have to push yourself to take on challenges when you see yourself as someone who grows through difficulty. The behaviors align with your identity instead of fighting against it. The long game. Let me tell you something that nobody wants to hear, but everyone needs to understand. There are no shortcuts. You can't hack your way to genuine capability. You can't shortcut your way to real wisdom. You can't life hack your way to meaningful growth. The path to becoming significantly smarter, more capable, more effective requires consistent effort over time. Months, years, a lifetime, really. But here's the thing. That time is going to pass anyway. A year from now, you'll be a year older regardless of what you do. The question is, will you also be significantly more capable? Or will you be essentially the same person you are today, just older? I think about this a lot. Where would I be if I'd started this journey 5 years earlier? How much more capable would I be today? But dwelling on the past is pointless. The only question that matters is, what will I be grateful for starting today? A year from now, I want to look back and think, I'm so glad I started then. Not, I wish I'd started earlier. The same is true for you. The compounding effect, visualized. Let me paint you a picture of what this looks like over time. Let's say you improve by just 1% per day. Not 10%, not 50%, just 1%. That's barely noticeable in the moment. You probably wouldn't even feel different day to day. But if you improve 1% every day for a year, you don't end up 365% better. Because of compounding, you end up 37 times better. 3,700% improvement. That's the power of consistency over time. Now, you won't literally improve exactly 1% every single day. Some days you'll improve more, some days less. Some days you might even regress slightly. But the principle holds. Small, consistent improvements compound into extraordinary results. Compare that to someone who tries to improve 50% all at once, burns out, gives up and goes back to their baseline. That person might have brief spurts of progress, but makes no sustained advancement. Consistency beats intensity over time, always, dealing with inevitable setbacks. But let's be realistic. You're going to have setbacks, days where you don't follow through on your commitments, weeks where life gets chaotic and your habits fall apart, moments where you feel like you're not making progress. This is normal, expected, part of the process. The difference between people who ultimately succeed and those who don't isn't avoiding setbacks. It's how quickly they get back on track. When I miss a day of my learning habit, I don't spiral into, well, I've already ruined my streak, might as well give up. I just do it the next day. One missed day doesn't erase weeks of consistency. When I have a week where everything falls apart and I don't maintain any of my practices, I don't see it as failure. I just start again the following week. The goal isn't perfection, it's progress. And progress is messy, non-linear, imperfect, but it's real. Your unfair advantage. Here's something I want you to understand. Implementing what you've learned from this conversation will give you an enormous advantage. Not because the information is secret or revolutionary. Most of these principles have been around for decades or centuries. The advantage comes from actually doing it while most people don't. Most people will consume this information, maybe feel inspired for a few days, and then go back to their old patterns. They'll know what they should do, but won't actually do it. But if you implement even a fraction of what we've discussed, you'll be operating at a different level than 95% of people, because most people don't continuously learn. They stop after formal education ends. Most people don't manage their attention. They let themselves be pulled in 1,000 directions by whoever screams loudest. Most people don't think systematically. They react to events without seeing patterns. Most people don't make decisions strategically. They go with gut feelings and emotional impulses. Most people don't build resilience. They let setbacks defeat them. Most people don't develop emotional intelligence. They're controlled by their emotions rather than managing them. If you do these things consistently over time, you won't just be slightly better than average. You'll be operating in a completely different league, the invitation. So here's my invitation to you. Not a challenge, not pressure, an invitation. What if you took this seriously? Not in a stressed, intense way, but in a committed, consistent way. What if you genuinely implemented these principles over the next year? What if you became someone who learns every day, even if just for 10 minutes? What if you became someone who protects their focus and does deep work on what matters? What if you became someone who thinks systemically and makes strategic decisions? What if you became someone who bounces back from setbacks and uses them as fuel for growth? What if you became someone who understands and manages emotions effectively? What if you became someone who communicates persuasively and builds strong relationships? Where would you be a year from now? 3 years? 5 years? The gap between where you are now and where you could be is entirely determined by the actions you take consistently over time. And the beautiful part, you don't need anyone's permission. You don't need special credentials or resources. You don't need to wait for perfect conditions. You can start today, right now, with whatever small step feels manageable. Final thoughts. Look, I'm not going to pretend I've figured everything out. I still make mistakes. I still have days where I fall short of my own standards. I'm still learning and growing. But I'm fundamentally different than I was 3 years ago. More capable, more confident, more effective. Not because I'm naturally smarter, but because I've consistently applied these principles. And if these principles worked for me, someone who didn't start with any special advantages, they'll work for you too. The question isn't whether you're capable of growth. You absolutely are. The question is whether you're willing to make the commitment and put in the consistent effort required. Because here's the truth. Reading this doesn't make you smarter. Thinking about it doesn't make you more capable. Only implementation creates transformation. So what's your first step going to be? Not tomorrow. Not next week. Today. What's the one thing you're going to start doing consistently to begin this journey? Choose it now. Write it down. Make it specific and manageable, and then do it. Today. Tomorrow. The day after that. Let those small actions compound. Let that identity shift emerge from accumulated evidence. Let yourself become the person you're capable of being, because the world needs more people who are committed to continuous growth, who think clearly and creatively, who make wise decisions, who bounce back from setbacks, who communicate effectively and build others up. The world needs the best version of you, and creating that version starts with a single small step taken today, repeated tomorrow, and compounded over time into someone you'll be proud to have become. So let's do this, not someday, not eventually, now. Your journey to becoming significantly smarter, more capable, and more effective starts today. What's your first move going to be?